Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Coffee with Friends. Today we will be discussing Mennonites as a panel. Um, there will be various types of Mennonites represented, and the conversation might reflect guests that have a diverse set of morals, values, and ethics that may not reflect the morals, values, and ethics of the Misfit Amish. Coffee with Friends may also discuss trauma of all sorts to include all types of abuse. Viewers and listeners may find it unsettling and triggering. If you find this live stream is causing you distress, please cease listening until you're able to listen again. You may also seek support from your trusted folks and qualified mental health professionals. With that being said, I'd like to welcome everyone to the show. We have George, Benita, Grace, TL, Stephanie, Judith, and Billy. Good evening, everybody.
Whoa.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
How y'all doing?
Not bad, thank you. Doing all right. Getting my afternoon coffee in.
Hey, I gotta have my coffee for this conversation. But as we get started, I would like to ask everybody to mute if you're not talking. And if we can, starting with George, going around, have everybody introduce themselves and tell us what kind of Mennonite you were and why you're here.
My name is George Blosser. What kind of Mennonite? I had to look it up. I've been out of the church for 44 years. So, church I grew up in is now an Ohio Mennonite Conference. I have no idea what that is now, but that's what they belong to now. What were the other questions you wanted?
What brought you here tonight?
Sort of to at least listen in on how other people see that, the subject of shunning, and hopefully spread the discussion a little wider in terms of, in my case, I look at my upbringing now and realize that the church I was in became very evangelical while I was a teenager, and I think aligned now way closer to fundamentalist evangelical non-denominational Christian than they do some brand of Mennonite. Mennonite's still in the name, but so if you ask them if they do shunning, they'll say no, but every aspect of shunning is still practiced in some form or another.
Well, that's going to be interesting. I can't wait to hear what you have to say. What about you, Benita?
Wait, what was the question? My name, the church, and why I'm here?
Yes.
Okay. It's been a long day. So yeah, my name is Benita Newfold, and I'm saying my last name on purpose because that usually validifies my Mennoniteness a little bit. I was born and raised in a Mennonite community in Chihuahua, Mexico. My grandparents were Old Colony. My parents were raised Old Colony. But when my mom and dad decided to get married, they were still considered Old Colony when they were dating. My dad wanted to leave the Old Colony church and join a Kleingemeinde church, which is a little less conservative than the Old Colony. And I think his parents supported him because my grandpa had his own beef with the church, and I could never figure out if he was officially shunned or not, but he was definitely a public enemy of the church, of the Old Colony church.
Okay, but what's a public enemy of the church?
They didn't like him. Had beef. There was beef all of his life. with the church. And I'll share a little bit of a story. I wrote down a couple things. I'll share one story a little bit later on. But I think he was a huge influence in my life. Yeah. So, but my mom had to fight hell and high water with her parents because her parents wanted her to get baptized in the Old Colony Church. Um, but she wanted to get baptized in the church that her boyfriend was from, my dad, which was the Kleingemeinde Church, which eventually they did. My dad put his foot down. My dad fought my grandma, my mom's mom, and they got baptized there and got married there. So for the first, how was it like, gee, how old was I? Maybe like 13, 14 years of my life, I was Kleingemeinde. And then my parents left that church and joined what they thought was an evangelical Mennonite church, but it was just some Mennonite dude who had been in the US and had really been inspired by charismatic churches. And so he came to Mexico and in Low German created this charismatic movement under the pretense that it was an evangelical mission church. But yeah, my parents were so done with Kleingemeinde, they're like, sure, we'll join you guys.
Oh my word.
Yeah, so that's where I learned to speak in tongues and holy laughter and
So why are you here tonight? Why do you think?
I'm here because well, Mary invited me, but Mary knows how much I like to talk about this stuff. And mainly my personal reason is because I have fought long and hard with my identity and the trauma from growing up in that church and that community. But I've made peace with it, and I'm still making peace with some of the things. And as you see under my name, it says I'm only here for the Schmonfat. So I started a TikTok channel, and I've never explained to my followers what that means, but to me, Schmonfat could be anything that serves you that you want to keep of your culture and let go of all the rest. So I still like the food. I like the language. I like the jokes, some of those things. And I will hold on to them. And nobody gets to shun me and tell me that I can't make it mean to me what it means to me, even though, like, the head covering is sacred. It's not sacred to me. It's just beautiful to me. That's it. So that's kind of why I'm here to claim my power that I get to claim, and nobody gets to tell me not to. It's my Schmonfat.
Oh, that's amazing. Thank you, Benita.
No problem.
I look forward to hearing more. What about you, Grace?
My name's Grace Weaver, as you can see. I grew up, or I was born in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, in the Old Order community, also known as the Grafdale Conference, also known as the Joe Wenger Mennonites. We moved when I was 5. We moved out to Wisconsin to another Grafdale Conference community. When I was 12, we moved to a nationwide fellowship church. At that point, I think my parents, although the Grafdale Conference would say they don't shun, my parents, I think, experienced some of that shunning, and I can talk about that more. But when we were part of the nationwide fellowship. My parents still are, some of my siblings still are, and I left when I was 20, and I have not been religious at all since. I'm here because I actually I find the culture of the Mennonites, the Plain communities, the Amish, everything, I find it extremely interesting, just the history and the just all the different cultures and subcultures in the community and how they interact with each other and with communities and just all the different practices. I just find it very interesting, and I enjoy talking about it and discussing it with other people who have been part of communities and people who are not aware at all of how those communities operate. So yeah, just wanting to talk more about how that all works.
Thank you so much, Grace. I'm really excited that you're here, and I appreciate it. How about you, TL?
Hi, everybody. I'm TL. I guess I'm keeping a little bit anonymous tonight. I'm a little shy and have maybe some family issues. So I think it might be better for me to stay a little bit anonymous for this time. But I grew up in a mainline Mennonite church, liberal, in central Pennsylvania. And my family was very involved in tracing Mennonite history, my grandfather, then my father. I even went on a trip with them when I was a teenager to trace our roots. They researched all of the areas where our family was from, actually my mother's family, other Mennonites. So it was, very impactful at the time. And, but I'm saying all that because it turns out that all three of their children and most of, say, the grandchildren have left the Mennonite church. And this whole idea of shunning is interesting to me, as I've kind of really gotten interested lately in researching Anabaptism and my family's history, and what it is that kind of like has caused us to leave when supposedly there isn't any outright shunning, right? As Grace already said, there is shunning in different ways. The definition of shunning has maybe a lot to do with why some people say it isn't shunning. The Amish and the Mennonites, there was a big split. Now, that was one of the main reasons for the split, right? So in my mind growing up, well, we don't have that, right? That's what makes us different, or dare I say better, right? But
Theo, are you really coming here with your Mennonite righteousness?
Indoctrination. That was in quotes.
Are you coming here with your, I could literally see you do this. We were better.
Yeah, exactly.
Holding your fingers up, putting it in quotation marks for everybody.
Right. So this kind of a bit of a holier than thou attitude about that, I think. But yet, I wasn't really aware of it as much during, my formative years until I was in college, and I was not in the same area, moved to Philadelphia, and the Mennonite church that was close to us, where one of my parents' relatives was going to church, in fact, I found out that they were kicked out of their conference for accepting LGBTQ folks and having a minister. I don't know all the details, but I think they approved, marriage, or so there was different aspects to why they were kicked out. And I was not surprised because I grew up pretty sheltered, and I myself wasn't real clear on what I felt at the time. I've since come out, much later as bisexual myself, but that really made a big impression on me. Like, they really kicked the church out of the conference and shunned the church, basically. And so they were kind of operating on their own without the support of the denomination. It became a huge fight, so to speak, and they really kind of helped push things in the liberal Mennonite, assimilated, as you want to call it, to push for LGBT folks to be accepted. But it took so long. Like, just in 2022 now, that was over 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that fight happened. And just now, the Mennonite Church USA, just 2 years ago, I think. So I haven't been a Mennonite for over 20 years. So I haven't followed every single, but I've, checked here and there on it. There's other reasons why I left the Mennonite church, but things like that, I think, are a big reason why if members aren't accepted for their basic identity, that's a huge thorn, as it is for a lot of a lot of Christian churches, of course. But I think we have to grapple with that, what the whole definition of shunning for that reason.
Yeah. Thank you. And you wanted to discuss shunning, and that's why you're here? Or did you have another reason for being here?
Well, as I kind of alluded to, like I'm really kind of gotten into research the family history a little more, because and what you had said, Benita, really touched me in terms of holding on to something from our roots. And I'm actually still in a house church of my parents that I grew up with. Yes, because I was taking care of my mother, and she was still going to that church. So I went with the house church took her to the house church because she had disabilities. And when she passed away, my partner and I, we just decided to keep going because it was a support system, and it was a way to continue my roots. It was not judgmental people in that group. So
well, that's wonderful. I'm so glad you're here. Thank you.
Yeah.
And what about you, Stephanie?
Hi. I think my background is kind of similar to TL's, although a little bit. So mainline Mennonite in a denomination that merged into MCUSA. I grew up in the General Conference Mennonite Church denomination in South Central Kansas, and both of my parents are from Mound Ridge, Kansas, which is kind of a Mennonite enclave. And I left the church about 20 years ago. I haven't been a practicing Mennonite for most of my adult life, but I did do I wrote my dissertation on the LGBTQ justice movement in Mennonite Church USA. And for better or for worse, I ended up going to a lot of denominational conferences as part of my research. I ended up interviewing a lot of people for my research. And all the dynamics that TL just described, I definitely saw in action. So if you had asked me then, do MCUSA Mennonite shun, I would have probably said the same thing I would say now, which is they say they don't, but they do. And shunning happens in a lot of different ways, and often with mainline Mennonites, I think it happens through passive aggression. Although I have seen some pretty overt shunnings with mainline Mennonites too. I do think the passive aggressive variety is more common. Now I am the executive director of Into Account, which is an organization that helps survivors who are coming out of abuse in a wide variety of Christian backgrounds. I've worked with lots of Mennonite survivors, primarily Mennonite survivors dealing with Mennonite Church USA and affiliated institutions. And based on that experience as well, I would definitely say that mainline or assimilated Mennonites.
Liberal Mennonites.
Yeah, I mean, liberal Mennonites is probably most accurate because liberal is kind of a Big Ten word.
Okay.
Yeah, they definitely shun. They definitely shun, and I think that the history and the sort of generational trauma that comes with shunning is really, really present in a lot of conflicts in MCUSA communities. So I'm really interested mainly in hearing more about just like what kinds of shunning experiences people from different Mennonite backgrounds have had, because it really, it is definitely something that defines Mennonites as a religious group. People do associate it with Mennonites, even though, ironically, like the Amish split had to do with Mennonites not shunning enough. I don't
No, it wasn't correct. It wasn't biblical enough. Okay. We were doing the Lord's work. It
Okay.
was the Amish way. That's the right way.
Got it.
Also said with all due sarcasm.
Yeah, good Anabaptist performance there. That was excellent. Yeah, so that's why I'm here, mostly to learn, but I can share a few insights about what I've observed and experienced with Mennonite Church USA.
Wonderful. Thank you, Stephanie. I'm really glad you're here. What about you, Judith?
First of all, I'm probably the only person who's here with just my phone. So let me know if, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So I'm Judith. I guess I'll leave out my last name for right now. I was born and raised in Old Order Mennonite Church, horse and buggy, no electricity in the home. Yeah, and the what brought me here is just need for a feeling of community with other people, and also knowing that somebody out there listening might it might be just what they need to hear us talk.
Well, I'm so glad you're here. Thank you so much. I look forward to hearing more. And what about you, Billy? Last but not least.
Yeah, I finally made it home to the house. I am Billy Holdeman Bass. I grew up mostly in the Holdeman Mennonite Church, but I, as somewhat as a teenager and then as an adult, attended and also worked for several Mennonite Church USA organizations. And I always had this idea. Sorry, Henry's excited. There's things going on outside. But I attended, let him out of the office. I attended, was working with a variety of those organizations. And the onset, there was a lot of things I thought, oh, it seems like they might have some progress on us. I learned in some ways they're almost more regressive than Holdeman's, which surprised me. And a lot of the same social problems still exist. And one of them is shunning, or as Holdeman's would put it, they call it the avoidance of excommunicated people. But all in all, it's the same, I don't know if it's nice to say, bullshit that really just causes harm to people. Oftentimes people who are the victims of misconduct in both circles. And the common trend is not only to carry on that conduct, but that leadership doubles down and further victimizes people. So to me, that's very important. I think it's important to give people a chance to do better. And I feel like there's enough people on this call who know that, some specific situations I've dealt with, that, people have been given so many opportunities to learn and grow and make better choices, and they don't. And sometimes it's not always clear why that is, but I think it's important that we hold these people accountable, because ultimately they have the power to cause harm to many.
Thank you, Billy. That really, really matters. I think it's very important. I think everybody came here tonight for a variety of reasons. And now I'd just like to know if, like, all of your churches, like, did they shun? Did they specifically shun? And what did they call it by something else? Like, if they didn't, what makes you think they shunned or didn't shun? If y'all want to talk about that, you're welcome to have an open discussion.
Well, when I opened up my part, I noted that the church I was in had a big influx of evangelical Christian movement in the early 70s. And they will proudly tell you they don't shun. But in 1980, they had a church vote on whether to accept a couple into membership. He had been born, that the male of that couple had been born into the Mennonite church, had a Mennonite last name. Only sin was he had been divorced, and this was his second marriage. And so, as is wont to do in Mennonite churches to divine God's will, you put it to a public vote in church after the Sunday morning sermon. And by raise of hands, the church rejected that membership by a 60-40 vote. I never went back to the church after that day, and I put in my request to have my membership removed. If a church denies membership in 1980 to somebody who's divorced, and then later that year probably goes on to vote for Ronald Reagan for president, is that shunning? I think it is. It's just by a different name. They were, and that was the first time I really saw what I'm going to call a purity vote. A vote of the church about, we have to maintain purity here, number one. Number two, it's the first time I watched conservatives, and bear in mind this is 1980 and Jimmy Carter is still president. This was a vote by conservatives to consolidate power and to take the church in the direction they wanted to go. And so is that shunning? Yeah, that's shunning in my mind. Not by name, but by every other task it is.
By definition.
Yeah.
Thank you, George. What about you, Benita? Benita, you are muted.
I love what you said in the beginning when you said, we'll talk about what shunning means to everybody, because I'd never thought about it. And now I'm rethinking everything. But what I had written down here is that the old colony most definitely shun. I've had family members that were shunned from the old colony church, and I don't know if this is the same for all churches, but when the old colony shuns, they believe that the doors to heaven are also locked with that. So by shunning somebody from the church, they are also damned for hell. And they take that from a verse where Jesus is talking to Peter and he says something like, and this key I give to you, and you will hold this key to unlock heaven. I don't remember exactly, but that's where they take it from. And then the Kleingemeinde, where my parents got baptized, became members, got married, and I attended until I was, I think I was, I don't know, maybe 10 years old. I do believe that they practice some form of shunning, but I don't remember anybody ever having been shunned. But what I can tell you is that their passive aggressiveness and bullying will let you know that you are very much not wanted at all. And it's fair game for everyone. Like, nobody will protect you, nobody will help you. It's fair game for the whole community to treat you that way. So eventually my family just left. And they didn't have to do the dirty work. They washed their hands. They didn't shun anybody. And they were the victims because, oh my goodness, we left a perfectly good church. Why would we leave?
Oh.
Mm-hmm.
We actually have a comment that I would like to read. I would show it, but it would cover up people's faces, so I don't want to do that. Maria Moore says, I wanted to share that my old colony Mennonite background resulted in my mother being shunned. She struggled with undiagnosed schizophrenia, which caused her to have risky behavior and promiscuity. Her 13 siblings turned their back on her struggles, and she became homeless for 15 years. When she died, her remaining sisters asked that they have her remains. I asked why. Because she needed to be thrown in the garbage, not buried in a Mennonite cemetery. Even in death, they expressed hate for her. And I can't read the rest of the comment, but thank you, Maria. What about you, Grace?
So I had the experience with the two main groups was the Grafdale Conference Mennonites, or the Old Order Mennonites, or Joe Wenger, and Nationwide Fellowship. So the Grafdale Conference would be, I mean, probably the most similar to Amish, but they're still very, very, very different. They claim to not practice shunning because they don't have the little rules like sitting at a separate table or not taking things from the other's hand, stuff like that. They don't have those little rules, so they feel they don't practice shunning. However, they do still to a certain extent. I mean, there's not like, I mean, it varies a lot from church to church, obviously, from family to family, from person to person, how they practice that. The biggest thing I found was simply not, say, for example, you have a business, they will, avoid anything, any sort of business dealings. They will generally create, distance. They won't want to be associated with you. They, it varies a lot. Like when my parents left the Old Order Church to go to the Nationwide Fellowship, it was really difficult for them because the Old Order Church felt that since they had, or my grandparents felt that since they had been baptized into the Old Order Church, they had made their vows to that specific church. And by leaving that specific church, they broke their baptismal vows. So they were very harsh towards them. Like my grandparents, my dad's father was fairly wealthy, and he helped us out a lot financially with medical bills and so forth because he felt like he didn't want to take the help from the church, felt that was a little bit below us, and so he helped us out a lot financially like that. So obviously that was the first thing that was cut off when we left the old orders, and my mom's parents just made life pretty difficult. Her siblings, um, some of them still had a good relationship, and some of them were just very, very standoffish, didn't really want much to do with them. Just the biggest thing I've seen with what I would call shunning is they raise you, they have you in the church, in the ways of the church and the ways of the lifestyle, to the point where you struggle to survive on your own without the support of the church. And that's the first thing they cut off, obviously, when you leave, is the support, any sort of support in the lifestyle you were used to. So their practice is simply to make that you are not able to survive on your own in a different situation or lifestyle where you almost feel the need to come back to the church. And obviously my parents were going to a different church. They didn't, the biggest thing was just the emotional part. They didn't face much other than being financially cut off from my grandparents. They didn't face much of other hardships in shunning other than just the emotional disconnect from people, they, friends, family. One thing that I've seen in other old order people leaving, obviously they've got horse and buggy when you go to a car Mennonite church, or go to a different, or leave completely and have a car. They won't want to drive with you or anything until a little bit down the road. Then all they want is for you to drive them around. So it's like they will say, they will say you're going to hell for having a car, but after the initial shunning period wears off, they will be very happy to use that car. They will be very happy to use anything you are now able to have that they cannot. The computers, the cell phones, the cars, whatever it be. But you have to survive that initial, the initial avoidance.
Removal of resources,
Mm-hmm.
and financial resources is a big one, Grace.
Mm-hmm. And then in the Nationwide Fellowship, they believe they're even better than the Old Order with that. But they do it once again. They keep lifestyle so restricted, that once you leave, you're hardly able to survive on your own without reaching back out to the church. And the one thing I've noticed with them is, I mean, they won't cut contact, but any contact that you have will be in an effort to win you back to church. So when I left, I basically cut contact because I knew that, and I knew I was not emotionally capable of handling that type of contact. So I essentially shunned myself because I knew I would not be able to handle that type of contact. And my siblings tried very hard to maintain that contact, but they quickly realized that it was emotionally more difficult to maintain the contact than it was to just give up and let it go and go mostly no contact. Because the contact you do have is extremely emotionally stressful. Just, yeah.
Grace, you mentioned feeling like you shunned yourself. You know, what if that was setting a boundary that allowed you to find stability mentally?
Yes, I felt when I initially left, I struggled with a lot of other things too. And one reason that I did leave was because for any sort of depression, anxiety that I dealt with, their solution was to, send me to green pastures or something. I did not want to, I wanted to get actual professional help, not the type of help they would offer. And so the first step for me was just to go no contact and seek out professional help rather than trying to maintain a relationship with them. I wanted to just focus fully on actually receiving the help that I needed rather than trying to maintain that connection, because that was just an additional stressor.
I'm going to ask this question. You said that you shunned yourself. I'm going to turn that into, in essence, we have to shun that community that we leave because they are now toxic to us. Is that
every single contact you have, that's all it is. It's essentially there are certain people in the church that is their mission. That is their mission to win you back. That is all they, and if you feel when they reach out to you, you feel you want that contact, you want something, but when you allow that contact to happen and you realize where it's going, and it's just like it's devastating, that's the only contact you can have, is them condemning your lifestyle and attempting to win you back. It's just too depressing to deal with. That no contact actually is more healthy for you.
And did they have a term for that? Do they call it tough love or something like that?
For as in the which
any of them?
So the main thing I think they would say is that cutting off like some of the support and so forth, that is to encourage you to come back, and it's also to avoid supporting a lifestyle that they do not agree with. For example, when my sister left, my dad attempted to support her to a certain extent, just to be there for her, yet, and they excommunicated him for doing that. They kicked him out for being too supportive of us that had left, and for not being a strong enough leader in his family. So essentially they punish anything that any type of support that may be given or may potentially be allowing a life on the outside or a life that they do not agree with. Wow. They will punish any type of activity that they believe is supporting us in that lifestyle. And that's why I'm kind of the evil one in my family, essentially, is I was the first one to leave. I did what most of them weren't able to, is I was able to break completely and survive by myself on the outside. A lot of kids that leave will, leave briefly, and when they realize they can't fully support themselves or they don't know how to survive a life on the outside, they'll turn right around and come back in. And I was able to break completely and survive on the outside. And when my siblings left then, and they were able to reach out to me, and I was able to support them in leaving, and therefore I'm obviously the evil one because I allowed them to leave as well.
Not to have gallows humor, but welcome, Grace. You're Sure. I'm an evil one too, you know.
And I think that's partially also why I have probably the least contact of any of my siblings with the church and with my parents, is because I'm kind of the one that is completely given up on. Nobody believes there's any hope for me anymore.
There's no hope for us. It's okay. I'm okay with that, but I'm also
I mean,
really proud of you.
yeah, it's been fairly recent too. You know, I mean, it's been like little over 4, almost 5 years now. So there's still some people that reach out and believe that they could potentially convert me back, but
hmm
for the most part, I'm
They
lost
just
cause.
they just gave up on you.
Hmm.
It's okay.
Yeah.
You
I
have
will
friends.
throw this in that I've been gone from the church 44 years, and last year I found out one couple was still praying for my soul actively every day. So
They need
you
to
gotta
remind you of that all the time. Yes.
Unsolicited prayers. They're the best. Right, George? They're the best.
I don't know what good they did, but just be prepared for this kind of dogged determination on the church side.
I found out afterwards that I was a little bit there weren't, in the specific community I was from, there were not a lot of kids, a lot of young people, not a lot of anyone that actually completely left the church and cut ties, and I was one of the first of the young people to do that. There were a couple that followed then. So I was a little bit of an anomaly. And initially, right after I left, I found out later from my siblings that they had a whole big prayer meeting that Sunday. They did not have a normal Sunday service. They had an entire service dedicated to whatever was going on with me. And
Whoa.
there was a lot of, I don't know, there was a lot of drama that went along with it, and I did not find out a lot of this till much later after my siblings left, you know, actually how dramatically they responded to me leaving, just because it wasn't very popular in that group, you know? I mean, if somebody left, it was generally to just a different church setting or something. There was basically no one that actually completely cut ties and completely left behind religion. So obviously they were very, very concerned about this and spent a lot of time in prayer.
You're living very rent-free in a lot of minds.
Yes, that's what I'm always thinking. When I hear about this, I'm always thinking about how many prayers are wasted on me.
I mean, do you begin to think that if their God is real, perhaps their God wants you to be living this life
Wants
if
me
he
to be here.
exists?
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
One thing that jumped out for me while Grace was talking is earlier, Mary, when you said, what does shunning mean to me? One word came to mind, and that was affiliation. And like Grace said, they have to cut contact with you because they cannot be affiliated with the world with sinful things and stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
So while they not right out come and say that you're shunned, but they won't have contact with you, like even your family would like to talk to you, but then they're affiliated.
Mm-hmm.
So shunning is really all about affiliation, and it starts to sound very, Mary, can I say the C word?
I was in the army. I've heard a lot of things, but I mean, again, the guests on our live streams, they reflect a diverse set of values. You're free to say what you wish to say.
Very, very culty. And maybe I think that because I've been obsessed with a podcast recently called Cult I Joined. Very, very interesting. And one of the cults, I don't even know which one it was, but they were only allowed to wear orange. So it's all about affiliation. Everybody only wears orange, right? And so when you talk about this kind of the church controls your affiliation, it starts to sound very, very everybody wears only orange. And that's all I'm going to say.
I struggled for a long time with labeling the communities I came from as cults. But the more I experienced from them, one thing that really made me think that this is a little weird is the way they controlled my siblings' information and their viewpoint of me and my lifestyle. We are not allowed, any of us that are outside the community, are allowed zero contact with our siblings, whether we wanted to or not. We would be allowed zero contact with them. My grandmother's funeral was earlier this spring, and my three youngest brothers did not come to the funeral because they did not want them to see us, the oldest of us that had left. And my other two siblings that left, they told me afterwards that they initially hesitated reaching out to me because of just the extreme things that were pounded into their minds about me and my lifestyle. They believed that I was truly a horrible person and that I was truly living a terrible lifestyle just because of the information that was fed to them by my parents, and they controlled any information coming from me, any letters or anything, to them. Obviously, they would control all that to keep them having a particular viewpoint. And leaving, my entire worldview changed. Obviously, initially when I left, there's a lot of things that I still believed from the culture, and there's a lot of things I still believe from their teachings and everything. But immediately upon leaving and just being exposed to all the other worldviews and all the other people in the world, everything, it just was a dramatic change in worldview, and I realized how controlled my worldview actually was by the teachings and by the information control in the church.
Can I ask you a question, Grace?
Yes.
Is it possible that when you said, I'm not going to initiate contact or try to rectify this, I'm going to set this firm boundary, they retaliated because you took back your power over your own life?
And the thing is, it varies a lot between different families with the way a child leaving is handled. I've seen a lot of different. Some parents, some families are still very welcoming to their children that have left and are very. They might disagree with their lifestyle, but they will still be parents to them. Same as you would towards a child that were to commit a crime or something, you would still be their parent. They operate kind of on that side. Now my mother, a lot of people see her as an extremely controlling, more narcissistic person, and she controls my father. Obviously, she controls our own family, our whole family, and I feel like for her it was an embarrassment. It was a bad reflection on her parenting skills, and therefore she basically, I recognize that she would do the maximum, basically the maximum shunning, the maximum whatever emotional infliction of emotional harm that she could to attempt to bring me back to my knees and crawling back to her, obviously. So that's kind of why me leaving went the way it did, almost, was just simply because of our family unit, our particular family unit. I think in some different family units it may have worked differently, but my mother just responded very. I knew she would, just from based on how she reacted to other things. I knew she would respond very, very badly to me leaving, and I saw it happen when my siblings left and attempted to maintain contact. So I knew it just wouldn't be great.
So the contact was very manipulative for both you and your siblings. And even going no contact resulted in a lot of manipulative tactics.
Yeah, and with my siblings, they attempted to maintain contact, but they quickly realized that any sort of contact would be manipulated against them. And her family, there's other relatives and everything that I could maintain contact with too. And I did briefly maintain contact with her brother because he had actually left the Old Order Church too briefly and returned to the Weaverland Conference, the Horning Mennonite Church. So he does have a car now, but he's obviously still good because he's part of a church similar to them. So I did maintain some contact with him, but her family all kind of backs her up as well. and it's been difficult having contact with her family as well. And on my dad's side, there's no siblings, so there's really no relatives there. And we have restarted a good relationship with my grandfather since grandmother passed. He's actually it's been pretty cool getting in touch with him again. I figured out a little bit where all the nerd and neurodivergence comes from because he's a huge nerd. And grandmother left. The first thing he did was he got a fax machine so he could communicate with us, and a little bit later he got a cell phone. So he's an 80-year-old old order Mennonite guy who is extremely, I would say he's extremely liberal in a lot of his viewpoints, and it's been really impressive actually regaining contact with him. And I'm really glad that I can.
I'm really glad that you can too. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you.
I really do appreciate you being here. What about you, TL?
Unfortunately, I have to head out. I really appreciate hearing the experiences and stories of everyone here. I just mentioned in the chat here, one thing I wanted to recommend was the Marginal Mennonite Society on the Facebook, if anybody knows about that. They just have a very, what's the word? Comedic and, but also, pretty socially forward look on society. But they have a great post about this man, James Wanger, who was co-editor while he was attending Goshen College in 1967. He was co-editor of the Menopause, an underground newspaper that scandalized the college community. And the 5 co-editors were soon in trouble with the administration, but especially him. Somehow the president of the university of the college, Paul Menninger, had secured a copy of the Berkeley Barb, which included an ad in the Gay Personals placed by Jim. And 4 of the Menopause co-editors were expelled from the school. But Jim found his way to Chicago, where he eventually came out, started a career, et cetera, et cetera. But it's again one of those things that even I looked at on the Third Way website. I don't know if you know about that. I'm sure Stephanie does. It's like their, kind of evangelical site, so to speak, to kind of let people know what Mennonites are on there. And their page about shunning the ban claims that Mennonites do not shun, matter of factly, and Amish still, some communities in Amish still do, blah blah blah. And I just all the way back in the 60s, they're kicking people out of colleges, and they're it's not this black or white thing they want to make it. But my experience was more subtle, so to speak, compared to people here. But it makes a lasting impact on yourself, especially when it's a part of your identity or you're part of your loved one's identity. My parents had cousins who were gay, and yet they weren't welcomed in their own churches, and it was uncomfortable in the family. And it certainly was not the extent of what Grace and Benita are talking about, but it still has a painful mark on one's life when you are ostracized subtly or without being able to be a member, or you have to hide part of your life. So, I'm glad to be here, and I hope we can keep the conversation going. And I'm sorry I have to leave a little early.
Well, thank you, TL, for coming. We do appreciate you sharing. And I just want to point out that trauma is trauma is trauma, regardless of whether, perhaps you might feel like somebody else's trauma was worse. Your trauma was still trauma, and trauma affects your central nervous system similarly.
Right. Thank you so much. Good night, everybody.
Good night, TL. And what about you, Stephanie?
Well, as before, TL was a good intro for me since she brought up some of the same things that I would. But I think that with mainline Mennonites, there are the example that George shared of the couple who tried to join the church and the membership was, voted against them. I have seen things like that. Those things still happen in MCUSA congregations sometimes. I've seen survivors get voted out of ostensibly liberal Mennonite congregations. And those things are horrifying, and absolutely they are shunning. Where I see the most widespread sort of imprint of shunning in Mennonite Church USA is probably the way that institutional abuse is handled. And, you know, mainline Mennonites really cling to their institutions and really identify hard with their institutions. And I'm pretty sure Billy is going to have some thoughtful follow-ups to what
Well, can I just ask you, do you think that the survivors of John Howard Yoder, do you know anything about that? How were those survivors treated?
Very poorly. Very poorly. And the way that they were treated is not markedly different, honestly, from the way that Mennonite MCUSA survivors are treated now. I mean, just to describe a really, really common trajectory, you know, whether the abuse is sexual abuse or spiritual abuse or, you know, domestic violence or some combination thereof, what I see repeatedly is somebody reports the abuse. There is some sort of institutional process that is re-traumatizing and re-victimizing and poorly executed in an inexpert way and violates boundaries and pretends to be legally informed and trauma informed and all the rest. And then a survivor responds to being treated that way, and then they are pathologized, labeled, and essentially shunned and made to feel that they are never welcome again in that institution. And then like what I observe amongst like often extremely progressive people in these communities is that they suspend judgment when it comes to Mennonite institutions and assume that there must be another side to the story that would explain why this person who is seemingly a victim has been treated so horribly. They, of course, are always the victim who wasn't telling the whole truth or who just was too mentally ill to help or what have you. Every survivor of Mennonite institutional abuse probably can tell you a version of this story. And so it's just like you can split hairs about the definition of shunning, but I don't know how many times I've had people who have experienced, you know, ill treatment of some sort in a Mennonite institution and then discarded, whether they're forced to resign or fired abruptly or what have you, or just their jobs are made intolerable or their lives are made intolerable. And they come to me and they say, I know what survivors are talking about now. I never thought my community would treat me this way. And it's like I'm dead to them. I've heard that from survivors of institutional abuse at Mennonite Central Committee. I've heard it from, you know, survivors of abuse in multiple MCUSA regional conferences. It's a really, really, and absolutely Mennonite educational institutions, from the seminary, you know, Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary to Goshen College, Bethel College, Heston College, Eastern Mennonite University. All of these institutions have these same patterns of compounding the trauma of abuse survivors by doing poor process and then trying to suppress any public or even, you know, open communal discussion about what happened. So reputation becomes a currency that is more important than any human life. That's what I see repeatedly in Mennonite institutions. And if that isn't shunning, I don't know what is. Its lived effects are very similar to being shunned from a high control religious group. And in essence, it is being shunned from a high control religious group. It's a high control religious group with liberal values that doesn't want to admit that it's a high control religious group, but it often is, especially if they're your employer.
Stephanie, what I'm hearing from you is that they're paying lip service to survivors
Oh, absolutely.
at the expense of the survivors' well-being.
To put it mildly, yeah. Yeah, they suck at this. They suck at this. I'm not going to mince words. I don't know what, like, there are a handful of Mennonites who are MCUSA Mennonites who are really trying to get it right. But, you know, I keep trying to not work on Mennonite cases because they're so bad for my mental health. But I do still hear a lot of stories because I'm somebody that people share things with after they've been shunned by whatever Mennonite institution surrounding community they have been harmed by. So yeah, I'm not gonna shut up about it. It's shunning. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's always the institution over the well-being of survivors. Bingo. Yeah.
So I have a question. This liberal group of people that don't want to believe these stories, can you categorize them by age or experience, or is it across the whole community?
That's a tough question.
I asked the question because of this. There is a 6-figure scholarship at Goshen Mennonite College in my parents' name. There was also equal contributions made to MCC and the local Mennonite church when my parents died. So why did that happen? Because my parents both worked for MCC. Both of my parents graduated from Goshen.
Mm-hmm.
They're now long gone, but when you talk about institutional ties, it went deep for my parents. My parents, for both of them, going to Goshen was the first in their families to go to college.
Yeah.
It formed everything about their theology and certainly informed their decision. My father was a pacifist and did not serve in World War II, but spent the entire time in civilian public service in this country. And as soon as that was over, he went to Europe, and he spent 5 years in Europe after World War II in MCC, and my mom spent 2 years. And in fact, that's where they met. So if they were still alive, I can easily imagine them having great problems accepting that these institutions were flawed.
Yeah. Oh, that's all of that's so familiar. I feel like I have a general conference version of that story in a lot of ways. And I think it's really people of their generation, like really a lot of them built their lives and their identities and their alternatives to pressures from the government, like with those institutions. And I see this coming out particularly with Mennonite Central Committee. I come from a family of like men who did alternative service with MCC rather than go to Vietnam. You know, I'm a generation younger. But it is really complicated. And I do think that my impression is that it is harder for older generations, and it's particularly harder for people whose entire professional lives, who sometimes are very highly educated people. I mean, you know, I come from a family full of PhDs, but we still have these issues because, you know, if you get your PhD and then you come back and you teach at a Mennonite college and you served in MCC and you go to a Mennonite church and everybody around you works for a Mennonite institution and you work with people that you go to church with and all the rest. And then somebody you're close to has a horrific experience with a Mennonite institution and everyone around you shuns them, then you have a moral decision to make. And it takes moral courage to be like, I don't like how that person's being treated and I'm going to stand with them even though I'm being made to feel like it's an affront to my identity. I mean, I see like like the most progressive Mennonites, like choose poorly in relation to that quandary and also choose well in relation to that quandary sometimes, all the time. We haven't been able to shake off these dynamics for some of the reasons that George you explained really well with your story.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you both for that. What about you, Judith?
Yes. So it's been over 15 years since my husband and I left the Old Order Mennonite Church, horse and buggy type. And I still struggle with it so much. This shunning thing, and it's not so much what any of them do or say or whatever. It's just that undercurrent of so there's certain things that we aren't allowed to do. If we were to push those boundaries, so we're allowed to come visit, we're welcome to come visit, but were we to push the boundaries that they have put in place, the shunning that they have put in place, we might get banned totally from coming to visit. So there's always this underlying feeling of anxiety for me. I really want to be an authentic person, and yet and I'm glad to be able to stay in contact, but it's also difficult. It can also feel really stressful. One of the things that I'm not allowed to do is help with any of their work. And my parents are very elderly and sometimes need extra care. And just seeing my siblings who are still with that church, running themselves ragged to take care of my parents when we could help. It's just, I have to watch that it doesn't get me down too much.
And when you say you know that whole like the caring for your parents and your siblings and all of that, like you feel like what I'm getting the sense of is that you feel like you have to toe the line. It's like you're being lined up. Like we're in basic training and we're lined up. Okay? Rows of soldiers, four rows, because that's 4 rows with like about however many people, probably like, 40, 50, 60 people. That's going to be your platoon. But regardless, like it feels like you're being lined up to go to be able to help care for your elderly parents, when in actuality, they just need care. Why do you have to toe the line to provide care? Am I wrong in what I heard?
My heart would want to, yeah, I'm not sure quite what you're saying there, but yeah, I would want to. I guess it just feels so ridiculous. I would gladly put in some time and effort to help, but because of the shunning,
They won't allow you to.
yes.
But also, to even maintain contact, you have to toe the line.
Yes.
Okay.
I have a
Yes.
question. So the contact you're allowed, they're kind of relegating that to the type of contact they would allow to any other outsider, correct? Basically, they probably wouldn't allow another outsider, just any English person, to put it like that, come in and help them with those types of things. You know, they're allowing you to have contact, and I've seen this in other order communities. They allow you to have the same contact as they would with any other outsider outside of their community, but there's certain things that they see as more intimate that you're no longer allowed to be a part of. Would that kind of describe the relationship, maybe?
Um, I can kind of see what you're getting at, but in some ways, we're like, I want to say we're worse. We're even worse than another
Even
outsider.
worse than the outsiders, yes. Yes, because we have rejected the outsiders don't know any better. They're just whatever. We have rejected their lifestyle and we have turned our back on that, and therefore we're worse. Yes. But
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
their shunning's not necessarily the same as the Amish, where they will entirely cut off all that type of contact, but they will relegate you to the same or worse as just another person from outside the church, with maybe even a couple more restrictions and
Yes.
whatever. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
in their eyes, would it be like you were in the will of God, or like a chosen one of God, and then you purposefully left? So, therefore, you're worse than a worldly English person who's never been in the will of God, who doesn't know
Exactly. Exactly.
So the English person is innocent because they don't know better, but you have purposely chosen to serve the devil.
Yes.
Okay. Wow.
What they always
Well,
said was, they always use that thing, to him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it is sin. So
Oh,
they always said, you know, we know the things we are supposed to do, we know how we're supposed to live, and we chose to turn our backs on that. Whereas the English people, the outsiders, whatever, they may not be aware of the sins they are committing, and therefore it's not as severe to them as it is to us. Or the
so
other thing, the one thing you were saying about being chosen people, they often talk about, and I don't know if it would have been, if this was more nationwide, or if the old order say this too. I can't remember. I was so young when we left the old order, but they often talk about us being the remnant, the chosen church, you know, the remnant of God's people. So we're a very special group of people, you know, and we were chosen. And if we leave, obviously we're turning our back on that. But they also believe then that everybody will get the chance, or this was, I don't know if everybody believes this the same way, or if this was just what I was taught, was that every person in the world will get the chance to hear the word of God and commit their lives to it. But some people will get a better chance than others, and yet therefore, even if somebody hears the word of God in passing and chooses not to follow it immediately, turn their lives around and follow it immediately, they will still be condemned. Whereas the rest of us that have been indoctrinated in it all our lives, and we choose to follow it, we'll get to heaven too. If we, like, how's that right? You know, if somebody gets just a brief introduction to that, whereas the rest of us are drilled in it our whole childhood, and somehow that's an equal opportunity to get into heaven. I don't know.
But you get extra stickers on your sticker chart if you've been in it longer and you've been a good and faithful servant.
and are you saying that you were given the sacred covenant because you were born into that church specifically?
Well, not exactly. It's not like a birthright or something. It's if you are part of that church, whether you were born into it or whether you came into it. But that specific group, whatever it was, like the nationwide, believed they were the ultimate. true church. And the old order obviously believed they were the ultimate true church, and whatever else. Each group believes that they've somehow got it down perfect, and they are the perfect remnant. Obviously, some of them believe, sure, yeah, the other churches might have it down good enough too, that they'll also be part of that remnant, or part of those final faithful saints or whatever that get welcomed into heaven. And
Why don't we start writing Mennonite mythology?
for us, it wasn't really whether you were born into it or not born into it, but the people that came into the church and the people that were born into it were treated very differently.
Oh, that's interesting. I think we kind of need to move on to Billy so that we can move along this conversation. Thank you all so much for these thought-provoking information. It's very helpful to think about things from that context. But hi, Billy. Would you like to talk about your experiences?
Yeah, well, I'll talk some about my experience, but then also I'm a note taker, and there's different things people touched on. And I think one thing that Grace was mentioning recently that was interesting to me, despite most Mennonite groups not claiming a one true church theology, I think the Holdemans are one of the few that like are so big about that. And even then, that's starting to get a little shaky for them because there's too many of them that have access to the open web through their second cell phone. But this chosen people remnant idea, and then also this idea that one, everybody's going to get a chance to learn the gospel and they have a choice to accept or deny. But then also, I remember one thing when I was growing up, and we had a minister out at our Western Kansas congregation, and I'll never forget the fear I had as he told us that basically getting out there, like passing tracts and doing all of the evangelistic things that Holdemans love to do, if people aren't getting saved and people from the outside aren't joining our church, it's your fault. You're failing in your duty. Because that is one of the most important things about being a Christian, is that you will share this with all your friends and neighbors. And I always took that very seriously. Everybody that I talked to, and I'm still very evangelistic today, just not in the way they would hope, but I always painted the picture that I was supposed to for who the church was. I brought all kinds of guests. I managed to get into college, and of course the only way I could go was Mennonite colleges. So I went to Heston College and Bethel College, and I took classes at Eastern Mennonite, and I worked for Heston College, and I worked for Goshen College. So I got to learn all of that. But there's this whole idea, we have to be always evangelizing people, especially the other Mennonites who are kind of confused. It's almost like they're drunk and can't walk straight type thing. And so I was really concerned about that when I was in college. I don't know how many carloads of friends I drove over to our church just outside of Heston and said, come on in. But, there's so much that I learned from my friends in college that really opened my eyes. It took about 10 years for it to sink in, but it's hard to turn down. And I think Grace did a good job of mentioning how once you do become open to these things and you experience the backlash when you confront injustices, not only are you losing the familial and social, but you're also, all of the financial support that you're propped up with goes away. Even if it's weak, that if you can't make it, somebody will come in and save you at the last. Dependency is a big part of what these groups do to people. I even worked for the church, and so I knew if I'm leaving, I'm gonna have to leave this job too, because I saw what happened with different people after they would leave the church. And there's still a lot of people that have left the church and they still work for the church, and somehow they make it work. And I think those are very special people, and I oftentimes admire them because they've done really good work, slowly but surely opening up people's minds inside. So those kind of people, I'm glad. I'm too loud and brash to make that. People wanted me out of there pretty quick. So that's been a big part of it. I think for me, I wouldn't have thought of assimilated Mennonites as shunning people until I experienced it myself. I never ended up joining that church, which I'm thankful for in a way. But because they don't hold church membership quite as strongly as we plain people would, you basically are kind of treated as if you're a church member if you are associated. And I also noticed that if you work for a Mennonite Church USA institution, they pretend that they vet people spiritually in a sense. They can't legally do that, but they kind of have these like social norms that they're like, if you're not a Mennonite, you better be able to agree to this list of things. And so if you agree to those things, then they basically hold you accountable as if you were a member. And most of my colleagues from when I worked for Mennonite Church USA institutions, all of them have either left or they treated me the same way and then later became victims of the same system. And so sometimes there's been a little bit of a, see what happened now? It was pretty shitty for you to not stand with people who are being victimized, because now look, you've done that. And I don't say that to them, but there's a part of me that thinks it's like, why couldn't you have seen this when I was trying to say, hey, we're on fire here? But I think what concerns me most is how unable they are to change, especially considering the educational components you mentioned, Stephanie. Like, people have advanced degrees, yet they're still victims of the system. They still will fall with the system. And ultimately, I think it's because it does benefit. George made a good point of mentioning with Goshen College some of these people who have such a strong institutional identity, and because of that, teamed with nepotism. John Howard Yoder's president, when he was at Goshen College, his daughter is now the president of Goshen College. And I hinted at it one time when I was having a very heated meeting with her in her office one time. But Becky Stoltzfus does not understand that the progress she claims to have made in her career and them as an institution is not there, because there are a lot of things that we've done that look good on a marketing moment, but when it comes down to it, we're still practicing the same sort of ignorant pattern of behavior. We still go in, not only do we treat victims of sexual misconduct, institutional misconduct, or simply just inequality horrible, but anyone who dares say something about it, they are then thrust out the same. And I watched so many of my colleagues get terminated or forced to resign because they wouldn't be quiet about things. And ultimately, it happened to me too. I got COVID and suddenly I'm on institutional leave because they're concerned that I'm creating a hostile environment. It's like, that's bullshit. The only hostility you felt was the accountability coming on you. And so, like, those kind of things, ultimately I was just like, it's not worth me even bothering here. It's time to exit this and just expose it, because ultimately sunlight's going to be the only thing that helps them. And ultimately, I see, sadly, very little hope that these institutions, whether they be plain churches or assimilated, and especially assimilated church institutions that have a lot of access to non-Mennonite people, the amount of harm is so incredible, and the inability and unwillingness to make meaningful change is so little. At this point, it's time for extermination. These institutions are so harmful. I hope in my lifetime to see them fail. And I really hate that, because I know that these institutions do have very good qualities. They have wonderful people. They have opportunity beyond all to make extreme change. They have so many wonderful connections, but they're thwarting that. And that's what really gets me fired up, is the lost opportunities. And I saw that so often as I met with people who would come to my office and say what is happening to them. And it always struck me how there's people who I really didn't even know them, but somehow they knew that they could tell me what was happening, and they would come and just drop the stuff with me. And so aside from the work, so many institutional workers in these institutions that are trying to make change, they're also carrying all of this weight, trying to support the myriad people who are coming to them. I mean, part of me, I wish I would have kept a diary of sorts of just the sheer number of people that would bring things to me and the time it would take while still trying to do my impossible job. And I think ultimately that's what kind of got me geared more to, and even while I was still with those institutions, I still got involved with some of this work, but it took me time. And I think there's people on this call who probably recognize I wouldn't have accepted if they told me to just drop it and run at the time. But yeah, it was, a lot of that. It's just what got me fired up with it. And now I feel like a big part of my life's mission is just doing what I can to warn everybody who says anything positive about those innocent Mennonite people that there is a lot going on here. And when, even as simple as meeting some lady in a wine shop who has a big Holdeman congregation in their town, and she's talking about how their church attendance is so low. And then you wonder, how do they keep all their people? And I said, it's because they are afraid to leave. So you feel good about your special group, you congregation of 30 people, you're the real remnant because you're faithfully trying. And just trying to give people courage and stoke them up in relation to all that people are experiencing. On this call, I'm really excited to see other people who see that connection, but also who are willing to be honest, also be a little spicy about it, because I don't think it needs to be all doom and gloom. We can have fun as we talk about this, but also recognize it's serious. I think the humor helps us cope because it's a lot of weight knowing some of this and knowing you can't do anything about it. And also, people continually reaching out. I have a lot of passion projects, and every day I can't keep up with the number of communications coming to me from people inside not only the Holdeman Church, but now there's people who see content online and they're like, oh my goodness, I learned a lot about the Holdemans, or I'm from a different plane group, and there's so much that I can relate to. And ultimately what I've found, there are a lot of things that are similar and different, but the garbage is the same. It has different labels, but the garbage is the same across these groups. And I also think it's not just Anabaptism that has this problem. It's broader, but this is our level of expertise, and this is the type of people we know the language that can hopefully give people a stepping stone to reach out. Because oftentimes it's things like this, it's simple things such as this that people either watch live or they see later, and it does open things up. And I always preach, like, if it weren't for this very program and Mary's work with the Misfit Amish and some of these other groups, I probably never would have been opened up. I never would have left. I probably would still be where I was 3 years ago, innocently thinking that I'm doing what, because the level of brainwashing is thick. Even you can have a PhD, be the head of Goshen College, and still be pretty thick. Sorry, Becky.
When you say you feel like you wouldn't have opened up, like, where were you 3 years ago?
3 years ago, I was in Heston, Kansas. After getting done with school, I didn't move away. I stayed there. A lot of it because my family, none of them were still with the church, and so it didn't make sense to move back home. And I didn't really know what other work I had other than to be faithful and obedient and carry out the work of the church, because I was raised in a family that highly valued the church and its institutions, and had a lot of support for that. And then, working in the church institutions, there's a lot of confirmation that we're doing good work, even though we're not ultimately. And I think a lot of people, they don't know any different outside of that. And there's a lot of love bombing that happens every time you comply with something that feels shitty, but is going to advance the church in some way.
That doesn't sound like a very great place to be. I'm sorry.
I'm not
But
sure
thank
how
you.
to respond to your question, but I do need to skedaddle before long.
Oh, well, that's okay. I was just trying to get to all the topics and kind of host a platform, maybe. I don't know. But I did want to give you the definition of mandated shunning from the Stop Mandated Shunning project, if y'all want to hear it. If you want to hear that before you take off, Billy. From the mandated shunning, Stop Mandated Shunning website, what they say is mandated shunning occurs when an organization forces its members to ignore and isolate another member due to ideological or theological differences. Mandated shunning even prohibits simple social gestures such as saying hi or sharing a meal. This practice is commonly used by high control groups to deter members from leaving the group or challenging its practices. Some religious groups who practice mandated shunning are Jehovah's Witnesses, ultra-Orthodox Jews, exclusive Brethren, Amish, Baha'i Faith, and Scientologists. Memberships in just these 6 organizations numbers in the tens of millions worldwide. Mandated shunning is a fundamental violation of the principles found in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. However, it escapes prosecution because legal professionals are deceived into thinking that shunning is a personal decision instead of an enforced organizational practice. It further goes on to say, mandated shunning is an inhumane practice and the ultimate form of organized bullying. It can result in total isolation of an individual emotionally, financially, and physically. Those who are shunned face the impossible choice between their continued loss of personal liberty and the eradication of everything they know and love. Does that make sense?
Doesn't sound like they made a choice to me.
Do you feel like Grace really had a choice? Or do you feel like George really had a choice? Or like Stephanie had a choice? Or Judith had a choice? Or even you had a choice? Or Benita? Did any of you really have a choice? How could you live a meaningful life when you were being asked to violate principles that you held near and dear to your heart?
I will say that I had to decide that I did have a choice. And my choice was an understanding that I needed to leave it, that church environment was toxic. It was no longer Christian. It was no longer following Christ. And I've read for as many things as I've read about people leaving fundamentalist religions, particularly Christian ones. The statement is often, I left the church because the church left Jesus. And when you understand that the church, you were taught certain beliefs about Christianity, and then you find that the church is not following them. They're following something else. And you're left with a decision. Do I want to keep affiliating with these people or not? And at 20 years old, I knew that they were toxic and I needed to leave. And I cut off almost all connection for many years, and most of it's still cut off. They're toxic people. They don't intend on changing. They intend to, most of them are MAGA Republicans, and they're doubling down on their beliefs. I never figured out in my 20 years of being there how I could possibly change them. And so I decided that rather than trying to figure out how to change them, maybe I just needed to go on and live a life that was meaningful to me instead of trying to convince them that they needed to accept me. So would we all have preferred in some way or another to stay where we were? Probably. But by making the choice to leave, we had the opportunity to become something else. And I think that's the story for all of us, is that we've become something else. We still have deep memories and ties and other things to these Mennonite and Amish conservative faiths, but we're not there anymore. We've changed. So I'm going to look at the positive side.
I resonate with a lot of that. Go ahead.
Can I ask one question?
Yeah.
Is it really a choice for people to just leave if they don't have access to the resources they need to be able to leave?
That goes on to a much deeper question, which is, I was fortunate enough to have put together enough resources to do that. But I can see so many instances where people don't have it. And is that fair? No.
Yeah.
I think
Okay. Go ahead.
I think I had more of a choice than most of the people here, because, I mean, one thing I will say for mainline Mennonite communities is they don't. I mean, it depends. If you work for a Mennonite institution and you like if your livelihood and your family and a lot of things are caught up with Mennonite institutions, that does curtail your freedom to leave. It feels important for me to I don't want people to go away thinking that I had my personal options constrained in the same way that people who are coming from really, really closed groups do, because I think the nuances are important. And the way that my kind of Mennonites exert control tends to be more subtle. I have been I have not had to make incredibly difficult choices that some people in this conversation have had to make. So I want to be real about that. I do have trauma. I do have shunning trauma. I do have versions of it, but
Stephanie, are you saying that you perhaps had a higher level of privilege within the group?
Big time. Yeah. No,
Thank you.
I have privilege within the different groups of people who are talking here now. And I also have privilege within the Mennonite Church USA system. Like privilege is the key here.
Thank you. Grace, you look like you want to say something.
Well, see, the thing with the old order church, what a lot of us, it was very difficult or nearly impossible for any unmarried woman or anyone not an adult to leave, because we were not allowed to have our own finances till we were 21, and even some unmarried women then would still have had their finances controlled by their parents. So all my earnings would have gone directly into my parents' account. And I left when I was 20, so I wasn't 21 yet. We were told we would be allowed to control our own finances at 21. Well, I worked 2 jobs, and I took on a 3rd cash job to save up enough money that my parents did not know about to actually be able to leave. And what they did with my siblings was, I mean, we were provided vehicles and stuff to get around to our jobs, but they weren't our cars, so we could not take those either. When my sister left, she was accused of stealing money, because she left with, she used a car that my parents provided her and stuff. So when I left, I tried to make sure that that wasn't the case, or I wasn't accused of that. So I left with the $2,000 cash I had saved up, and that was it. And obviously not everybody has the same, even in the older community, not everybody has the same ability to do that as I did, because my parents were actually much more lenient than some were in allowing me to work in places in non-Mennonite businesses. Most old order Mennonite girls, or nationwide girls especially, would have only been allowed to work in Mennonite businesses, or businesses that were run by Mennonites, or work for other Mennonite families. So I was allowed to go outside of the Mennonite businesses, and therefore I was able to get a little more leeway that way and able to lead that way. But most of them almost don't have a choice. I mean, unless they can get some sort of help on the outside, they're stuck. I mean, there's, for at least financially.
I find that interesting because, in essence, in my own situation, my parents were much more educated than the church, more liberal than the church, and they presented certain opportunities to me that now I can look back on and said, I took that little opportunity and I maximized it just to be able to get away and to do what I wanted to do. now I can look back and see those little footholds that I could get into that outside world to take it and go. That had that been a more conservative world, more conservative parents, I might not have had those little footholds. And they don't have to be very big, but just that opportunity to work outside the home in a non-Mennonite business. Suddenly there's a foothold there that if you could take it or not take it, you took it.
And I feel sometimes because I took it, it ruined the opportunity for some others, because suddenly all the other parents, and my parents included, recognized where I was able to gain the opportunity to get the resources I needed to leave, and they snatched those away from any others that may have attempted to use those to leave as well.
So what I'm hearing in that discussion is that there is an unfunded need for people who want to leave those high control groups, particularly women, who may not have the resources to get out. That you were able to fund your own and then help fund siblings, but there's an unfunded need there that if you leave and you have no resources, where do you go? Do they know where they can go?
That's a very valid point, George. I know a group that is working towards creating a religious trauma center in North America. As of right now, they're moving forward, and hopefully we should have more information on that. Say again, Grace. Can y'all hear Grace? I can't hear her. It's like she's frozen.
Yeah, I think she froze up.
Yeah, Grace, we can't hear you. But as I was saying, I know that they're working towards creating a religious trauma center. That is one thing. But the other thing is anybody should be able to reach out to their county crisis intervention center. Different states have different types of agencies that work in domestic violence, interpersonal violence, even sexual assault. For example, there's PCAR, which is Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape. Just different states have different names. There's also RAIN. You can call RAIN if you need assistance, if you're being abused. But typically, in order for you to receive those services, you have to be being abused. So anyways, I'm really grateful that we had this conversation. I have one question for, I believe, Stephanie, that I wanted to ask Stephanie. Emerald says, do you think this veneration of institutions is indigenous to the Mennonite group or to high control groups in general? For context, I'm ex-Presbyterian.
No, I don't think it's indigenous to Mennonites. I certainly think it's a quality of high control groups. Mennonite, and I've worked on multiple Presbyterian abuse cases. I'm working on one right now. I have observed some of the same patterns in Presbyterians. Of course, there are different Presbyterian denominations, but I think when you have religious groups that have a sort of sectarian, sectarian meaning, closed, isolated, high control. If there's any sort of sectarian past or present combined with modern institutionalism, it's a funky mix. And I do think that can, when you have those dynamics in play, I mean, I'm thinking about Mennonites, Church of Christ, Baptists, just there are lots of
Mormons, LDS, Seventh-day Adventists, Scientologists.
Yeah, Scientology.
Jehovah's Witnesses. Did we say that one?
Yeah. When you have those things combined with institutionalism, I think you're going to have some of these dynamics. But I have been like something, just because the person who commented was Presbyterian, I mean, something that I have observed with Presbyterians is a real loyalty to their own institutions that sometimes curtails the ability to find genuine expertise outside of them. That's a pretty common problem for churches in general. But yeah, I wouldn't want anyone to think that we're making these arguments thinking it's only Mennonites who have these problems. These are problems with institutions and problems with high control religious groups, and there need to be society-wide solutions. Like we can't solve them on our own.
Thank you, Stephanie. And welcome back, Grace. I did want to ask
Sorry,
every...
I wasn't watching my laptop power and I got kicked off.
That's okay. I was going to ask each of you, so if you wanted to give a brief message of like 30 seconds or less, going around and just say to anybody who's listening to this and has related to this, or, you know, has experienced some of the things y'all have discussed, what would you say to them? You want to go ahead, George?
What would I? Oh man, I got. See if I can summarize this quickly. When you're in a high control group, their interest is for you to not have a world outside of that control group, and it becomes, when you become aware of the fact that they don't want you outside their little circle, you have to ask, what's outside that circle that they don't want me to have? And what's valuable out there that I'm not allowed to touch? And if it's going to take some guts and some courage to go out there and find out what that outside world is. But for all of us, we've gone out there, had to show that courage, but we found that there was generally more acceptance, more caring for who we are. We were allowed to be who we are in that outer world. And now I wouldn't trade the life I've got now for anything I had 45 years ago. So it's worth the risk.
Thank you. That's a very powerful message. What about you, Benita?
I would say for anybody that's listening who has arrived at a place where they recognize that their background has caused them pain. Is there a little bit of feedback from my mic? Is this better? Okay. And they're not really sure what to make of it. I would say stop for a second before you throw the baby out with the bathwater. Check in the tub, see if there is a baby in there. Check if there's something that you personally value. Not that your church wants you to value, not that your grandma wants you to value, not that your parents want you to value, not that your partner values. Find out who you really are and what is meaningful to you, and hold on to that. And the rest of it, chuck it. Chuck the whole tub, whatever. Keep the baby, whatever is meaningful to you. And when you chuck it, make sure you do it with a certified professional mental health therapist, because you will need that.
Oh, that's important advice. Thank you, Benita. What about you, Grace?
The most important thing I think is what they always drilled into us is that once you leave the church, you will lose all your community, your support, your everything. You'll be completely on your own. And I quickly discovered on the outside, that doesn't have to be true. There's support, there's community on the outside. It might take a little bit to find it, but it is there. One thing that was a little bit difficult for me to start out with, I am not a very sociable person at all, and I tend to be a little bit reclusive. So for me, it took a little bit to get out there, and it's a lot just my siblings currently and a couple other people, because I find a lot of the people that have left from the same type of community that I have are extremely hardcore conservative still, and they're not very open-minded, and they tend to stick with some of the same beliefs and principles that are with the church. They tend to kind of hold some of those same things, and not necessarily. I mean, I'm not going to judge them for it, but it's hard to find somebody you really resonate with sometimes. But it's out there, you know. There is support, there is community, and it might just take a little bit to find it, but you will find it. Whether it be from other fellow people that have left, or whether it be just people from the community that, you know, you learn to know them, you make your own community.
Oh, that's good advice too. Thank you, Grace.
There's people out there for you. It doesn't have to be the church.
Thank you so much. What about you, Judith?
Yeah, I don't really have a lot of advice or, yeah, in that line. I just, if you're out there, someone who is struggling also with the emotional side effects or trauma of shunning and feeling like you're less than or something, I just I want you to know that you're not alone, and I don't really have any advice. Just yeah, there's more of us out here around here.
Even when it might feel like you're alone, you're not alone. Thank you for that message. You're right, there are more. And regardless of what background that people come from. But thank you. And what about you, Stephanie?
I would say I've learned one of the hardest things to let go of coming out of high control religion in general is the idea that there's one best way to live. And that extends to there's one best way to be a family. There's one best way to be a person with sexuality. There's one, and we know that from that idea comes our hierarchies, our internal caste systems, all the things we're trying to leave. But it's one of the hardest things to let go of. I see survivors of high control religion struggle with it a lot as they try to figure, well, does the Bible let me do this? Really, I think the Bible says and it's so hard because of, when you're taught these things when you're really young, you're always, even if you leave that particular high control system, it can be easy to get caught in a cycle of trying to find the right one. And I guess my message is it's just really there is no right one. We're just accountable for how we treat people. And there's all the other things that people said about community, and there are people out there for you that's part of that too. When you let go of that idea, it's much easier to find your people. And then finally, I do want to say, if you are a US citizen and you're registered to vote and or find out if you're registered to vote, these issues are directly relevant to the election coming up. Are the interpretation of religious freedom that the right wing in the United States and the Republican Party is espousing gives broad freedom not to individuals, but to tyrannical religious authoritarians to do whatever they want. And it will be harder for people to leave high control religion, even harder than it is now, in a society where we don't have social safety nets, we don't have networks of mutual care, and we hunker down into our different high control groups and disdain and insult each other. And that is really relevant to on next Tuesday. So please, if you are able, vote. It'll make everything easier if we don't have to fight theocrats from the top of the country.
I
Thank
would
you.
like to circle
Oh.
back on one other idea that I sort of heard Benita mention, that your own personal truth is always more important than anybody else's gospel. And we grow up with everybody else's gospel coming at us. What we don't learn is to value our own truth. So a lot of the journey is coming to the point where we value our own truth, and then we put the value of our own truth above everybody else's idea of what gospel is. And suddenly that becomes our gospel. And if we then say, we got to follow our own truth over anybody else's idea of it, and that will lead us. And the other thought was, as we talk about this idea of leaving a high control group and we have no community around us, one of the places I have found community has been in music. We all almost always love some kind of music. Go out and find the music you love, immerse yourself in the groups of people that like that music, and you will generally find a community of like-minded people. And there's no creed. You don't have to swear an oath to any Bible or any God.
Oh my God.
Stand in front of the music you love and have that communal experience with other people.
Mm.
So, that has been a place where I have found and built community that I didn't expect.
Sometimes we're really shocked by where we find community and where we find meaningful connections. I really love that you brought that up. But yeah, I do have to wrap it up. Benita said the Church of Jelly Roll. So if y'all don't know who Jelly Roll is, I do have a song recommendation for you. Okay. I'm going to say this. George and I recently went to a concert of Willie Carlisle where he played, and he sang this song about his father passing away. I'm pretty sure I laughed and cried at the same time because it's about his father being abusive. And it can still be sad when abusive people die, but also he looks in the mirror and sees his father. And the way that I relate to that is interesting. And I don't know that I really have the space or the time or the energy to delve into it deeper than that. But look it up. Look up Willie Carlisle. Look up Jelly Roll. And also know that each of you are worthy of living a meaningful and joyful life. You are perfectly imperfect. You deserve good things in life. You deserve to have connection and community and to feel valued for who you fundamentally are as a person. And as Stephanie said, please go register to vote and vote. It matters. I'd like to thank everybody for listening and engaging with this content. As always, you can like, share, comment, and subscribe. And thank you to our guests, for each of you, even the ones who've left. Thank you for coming and showing up and having this conversation. I think it has been long overdue to have this conversation, and I'm really grateful to have the honor of hosting it. Thank you for trusting me to do that. And thank you to our Patreon subscribers for making it possible for the Misfit Amish to produce this live stream. And thank you, BJ, for the art. And until next